Welcome everyone to our first ChangeMaker event of 2022, Profit, Planet and People, Navigating Corporate Social Responsibility. On behalf of UQ, I'd like to say in my own Wiradjuri language, Maranyeria, Yinjamaradu, Mianjingu, Mangu. Good evening. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of and caretakers of country here in Mianjin, Brisbane, where I'm speaking to you from tonight. I'm excited to say we are joined tonight by 736 people from over 31 countries across the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. We were hoping to see some of you in person this evening in Melbourne, but unfortunately, with the COVID-19 situation in Australia, we made the decision to host the panel online, just to ensure everyone remains safe. Now, on to this evening's discussion. We're joined tonight by our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Deborah Terry, AO, and 3 UQ alumni to discuss corporate social responsibility, otherwise known as CSR. The idea of CSR isn't new, but in the age of informed and empowered consumers and shareholders, it's no longer just a smart PR move, but a fundamental business consideration. As a society, we expect more of our companies and organisations. We want honesty, we want authenticity, we want corporates to take responsibility for their actions, and we punish them when they don't. In today's world, companies need a social licence to operate. It's not a matter of simply producing a supply to meet a demand. It's doing so in a socially and environmentally conscious way, and which meets the public's expectations of what is right and what is acceptable. I'm excited to get into this discussion with our expert speakers. We will be hearing first from UQ's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Debbie Terry AO. Debbie is currently a Fellow and past President of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, as well as an appointed member of the ARC Advisory Council, amongst other roles. Debbie began her distinguished career at UQ in 1990 and rejoined us in August of 2020. Our panellists this evening are Susan Mizrahi, Catherine Fagg AO and Malcolm Broomhead AO. Susan Mizrahi is a senior sustainability strategist with over 20 years of global experience. She has led change on social and environmental issues within the private, public and non-for-profit sectors, and was appointed as the inaugural Chief Sustainability Officer at Australia Post in 2019. Susan is also a sustainability representative for several national retailer groups. Catherine Fagg AO is an experienced chair and board member working in senior executive roles across a range of industries such as resources, manufacturing and logistics, banking and professional services. She is currently chair of the board of CSIRO and is on the boards of the National Australia Bank and Djerriwarrh Investments, my apologies. In the not-for-profit sector, Catherine is chair of the Breast Cancer Network of Australia and Water Trust Australia Limited, also serving on the boards of the Grattan Institute, the Myer Foundation and the Champions of Change Coalition. And Malcolm Broomhead AO is a professional non-executive director, currently serving at BHP Group Limited and BH Group PLC, as well as chair of Orica. In the not-for-profit sector, Malcolm is director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute and sits on the advisory board of Opportunity International Australia. He was formerly chair of Arciano Limited and managing director and CEO of Orica Limited. He has extensive experience in the resource industry, as well as finance, investment and construction. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us tonight. First of all, I'd like to ask the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Debbie Terry, to open the conversation. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Anita, and good evening to everyone watching tonight. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. As Anita mentioned, we're really disappointed that we're not holding this important discussion as an in-person event in Melbourne, where our 3 panellists are based. That was the original plan for this event. However, given the Omicron surge that we've had over summer, we really felt that we had no choice but to shift this ChangeMakers event to an online format once again. Despite the current COVID-related challenges, we are optimistic that before too long we'll be able to safely bring our alumni community together again for in-person events. Speaking personally, I can't wait for that opportunity. Nevertheless, it is really encouraging to see that our alumni community remains engaged in exploring important issues and that there is a real appetite for the discussions that we host via this ChangeMakers series. This evening, as Anita said, we have more than, we have more than 700 people who have registered to watch online. This audience works across all types of industries: finance, resources, utilities, transport, agriculture, healthcare, academia and consultancy services. And we have alumni watching on from 31 different nations. The vast majority of you are living and working here in Australia, but we do also have, as I said, alumni engaging from far-flung locations, including Botswana, Brunei, Bulgaria, Ethiopia, the Maldives, Mauritius, Peru and Zambia, to name just a few. For me, that's very reassuring because it indicates that this issue of corporate social responsibility is of universal interest to people working across industries and around the globe. It's uplifting to know that we have so many like-minded alumni with a passion for creating positive change in the world. As some of you may be aware, at the end of last year we released our new long-term strategic plan for the University of Queensland. In that plan we recommitted to our vision of creating knowledge leadership for a better world. And we refined how we express our mission so it is focused on, and I quote, delivering for the public good through excellence in education, research and engagement with our community and partners. Of course, we are primarily known for our education and research programs, but beyond those programs, we want UQ to be known as a socially progressive and environmentally responsible organisation that also enriches communities through connecting people, building capability, hosting debates on the big issues and raising awareness on these issues. This ChangeMakers event is one manifestation of that commitment, but there are so many more. Perhaps the most visible expression of our commitment to being a responsible organisation is the 64 megawatt solar farm that we've built near Warwick, about 2 hours southwest of Brisbane. When it is fully operational, UQ's Warwick solar farm will produce enough electricity to power 25,000 households. But even more importantly, that new facility is already providing real leadership in areas of renewable energy research and education. So it's helping us to contribute to the very important transition that the world must make to a net zero carbon future. Beyond the Warwick solar farm, there are many other examples where UQ is creating and sharing knowledge that contributes to solving some of the world's biggest social, economic and environmental challenges, from mitigating climate change to food and water security or preparing for the next pandemic. And increasingly we're exploring these challenges and developing solutions in close partnership with corporations, industry and government. In partnership with Dow Chemical, for example, the UQ Dow Centre is focused on applying engineering research to create innovative approaches to energy production and more sustainable use of materials. More broadly, the research that we conduct at the Sustainable Minerals Institute or our major institute in collaboration with the state government in the area of agriculture and food innovation, that research is done almost entirely with our industry and government partners, with the aim of improving productivity and sustainability in the resources and the agricultural sectors. At UQ we relish these opportunities because our corporate and government partners have the scale to create important and sustainable change. They have the power to change consumer behaviour, as well as the capacity to build trust, public trust, and to have positive influence on all aspects of our culture for the benefit of our whole society. And this really goes to the heart of why corporate social responsibility is vitally important. In this era of global inequality and climate change, we need large corporations and organisations to use their scale and their influence to create and drive positive social, economic and environmental changes all around the world. This is going to be vital to securing progress, peace and sustainability for the planet. Here at UQ, we are very conscious of our responsibilities in this regard. As one of the world's top 50 universities, we already have a global impact. Indeed, more than 1/3 of our students come to UQ from overseas, and we have partnership agreements with over 360 universities or organisations outside of Australia. So it is incumbent on us to ensure that our global activities and interactions are managed in a way that's both responsible and sustainable. And to that end, I was pleased that UQ became a signatory to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals last year. Signing up to the SDGs is a very deliberate statement about our ambitions to address the world's most pressing social, economic and environmental challenges. I'm so proud of what we've achieved already, but of course there's always more that we can be doing, and I'm sure that there's more that we will achieve in the future. I hope tonight's ChangeMakers session gives you some reassurance that however daunting things may seem, many organisations are seeing the value in committing to net positive impact in the world. Thank you once again for joining us, and I'll now hand back to Anita to get this really important discussion underway.
Thank you, Debbie, for kicking tonight off and sharing more about some of the things UQ is doing in the CSR space. Starting off the panel tonight, let's really dig into what it means to be a responsible corporate citizen. Now, each of you work with large organisations and you've seen how important it is to meet certain social and environmental standards to be granted that very important social licence to operate. What are you finding people are expecting of your organisations and more broadly of your industries? Susan, can we hear from you first? What's your perspective working at Australia Post?
Thank you so much for the question. It's really terrific to be with you all today. Look, the issue of corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line, people, profit, planet is not new. It's some 30 years old. But the notion of being a responsible corporate citizen has evolved during that time and driven by changing social and environmental challenges. There's absolutely no dispute that there's changing customer and workforce expectations. The acceleration of ethical investing, ongoing globalisation, increased access to information and education are all factors that are contributing to the changing expectations on and also within companies and businesses. With Australia Post in particular, maintaining our social licence to operate is absolutely critical. We're one of Australia's most trusted brands and a government business enterprise, and so it is owned by the Australian government and by extension it's owned by the Australian people. And when we take decisions that are deemed to be out of step with societal expectations, it quickly makes headlines, as some of you may have seen. It can be detrimental to our brand and to our people and also to our commerciality in what's an increasingly competitive e-commerce space that we're playing in.
Thank you so much. Just moving to you now, Malcolm, what would you say to this based on your own experiences?
Yes, business has always had to satisfy the needs and wants of its customers, and that's fundamental, but traditionally that has meant in the products and services that we deliver. But increasingly, it also encompasses how those products and services are delivered, and by that I mean whether they're done in a sustainable and enhancing way, to communities, both the communities in which a company operates, but the general community, and to the environment in which we operate. And people still expect businesses to generate the wealth which underpins our standards of living, but they also want us to do that without harming the climate, without affecting climate change, and indeed by enhancing local communities. For example, we have emissions targets. We have expectations around dealing with heritage issues with Indigenous people and with archaeological issues, which are just fundamental to us and can enhance our reputation or shut us down if we don't get it right. And that pressure is much, much stronger than it was even 5 years ago. And it's now much more urgent.
Thank you, Malcolm. I know you're speaking to a lot of the issues, both of you, that our alumni are interested in. Now, Catherine, what would you say people are expecting of your organisation and industry?
Given that I'm involved with a number of organisations, Anita, it tends to be rather a variety of things. But I'm going to go back to the point that Malcolm started with, saying the most basic thing is that we are very good at what our core function is. And Debbie mentioned about the importance of research and education. If you're a university, I'm involved with CSIRO. Guess what? We're really focused on delivering excellent science to deal with the biggest problems that Australia faces. I'm on the board of NAB. We are absolutely committed to providing a very safe place for people to do their banking. So that to me is absolutely, we can never lose what is the purpose of an organisation. And then of course the question is, as we've gone to here, is how do we go about doing that? And as we're going to be exploring some more, in many ways expectations just keep ratcheting up for organisations in the way that they do go about doing things.
Thank you so much. Of course, we're looking, as you mentioned, purpose. How do we marry core business with CSR? And we're going to unpack some of that tonight. Now, we are often seeing businesses, and particularly large businesses, operating ahead of governments around the world in terms of addressing social and environmental concerns. Why is it, do you think, that that's the case? Malcolm, can we start with you, please?
Look, I work primarily in the resources industry, and we deal directly with issues of the environment and particularly climate change and communities. We do things in those in that context. So we affect the environment, and we directly interact with Indigenous people. So we will often provide a lot of help around employment and education and so on for Indigenous people in a very direct way. Now, if we don't do that sort of activity well, then social media, as we've been saying, it enables the whole world to understand that very quickly. And people care deeply about these issues. And those people are often, for example, investors in funds that our fund manager shareholders run, or they are customers of banks, and they will therefore pressure those organisations and anyone in the resources industry that doesn't operate responsibly in a social sense will find it difficult to continue to get funded going ahead. Governments, I think, have a different time frame. Governments set policy much more than direct involvement, and governments have to satisfy a lot of competing interests and tend, therefore, to have a different time frame and perhaps a slower time frame than we do.
Thank you, Malcolm. I think we could do an entire series on the impact of social media and policy and so forth. But we'll move on to Catherine. Catherine, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm really going to build on the comments that Malcolm has made, because I think very simply it is actually much easier for businesses to take the leadership on these issues relative to government. And Malcolm said there, of course, are timeframes that they're dealing with, but just the breadth of stakeholders involved. Whereas if you look at a business, we've had customers in the various businesses I've been involved in, we've been having conversations with customers about carbon emissions for over a decade. Our people are really invested in it. The really big shift in the last couple of years in terms of investors ratcheting up their focus on emissions and social responsibility. So it becomes a really straightforward case for business to say, this is really important for us. We need to do this for all of our stakeholders. And clearly the community is now coming along as well.
Thank you, Catherine. And Susan, why do you think businesses are operating ahead of governments?
So actually, I don't know if I entirely agree with the premise of the question that businesses are operating always consistently ahead of governments. Certainly there are businesses that are leading the pack, and you look at your Unilevers and Patagonia and IKEA. But for every great example you can highlight, there are absolutely more companies that are falling short and not doing enough in terms of society or the environment, or they're failing their governance practices. If you look at business practices in Australia, in the Australian context alone, among the top 200 ASX listed businesses, the number of women CEOs fell from 14 in 2018 to 10 last year. So that's 10 companies with a female CEO out of the top 200. Or if you look at the number of Australian companies that have a science-based target, it's actually only 23. And also, the issue of gender pay equality. We were legislated in Australia to pay men and women an equal rate since 1969. So that's like more than 50 years later. We all know that women are still not being paid the same for the same role. And so for me, the polarisation of business and government sectors is not really helpful in advancing our sustainability agenda. I feel very strongly that business, government and civil society all have a role to play. Frankly, we've all got a lot more to do. None of us are doing enough.
Thank you, Susan, and particularly for raising the gender inequality as well. Just moving on, as we've discussed, CSR has really gone from being a nice to have to a must have for business and industry. And we've seen a particular spike in this in the past 2 years or so. Why do you think that is? And do you see a time in the near future where corporates value people and planet as much as profits? Of course, this is the ideal world. Catherine, do you mind answering that first, please?
Really, really pleased to do it, Anita, because it has been really fascinating, just the shift in the last couple of years. Now, I think corporate social responsibility has always been very important, but there has been a particular ratcheting up around emissions, carbon emissions and sustainability. And I think there are multiple reasons for that. It's going to say, and I'm originally an engineer, so I'm going to say, first of all, the science is more compelling. It's more confronting to see what is actually happening with weather around the world. We've also had very dramatic shift in political leadership around the world, most notably with the US presidency. And if we ever needed a reminder that nature would have its way, COVID has really brought that home to us over the last couple of years. And I do think people are thinking about the world and their responsibilities differently as a result. In terms of, I do want to talk about big companies, and clearly I'm associated with big companies, because perhaps the thing that has been most interesting is that investors, the biggest investors in the world, such as BlackRock, which manages around $10 trillion worth of funds, they are absolutely taking the lead on this. And they, of course, have a very long time frame in terms of making investments. So they recognise just how important it is for companies to be prepared for what is changing in the world. And they have very loud megaphones. And so a lot of the noise and discussion we're now hearing in big businesses is definitely being influenced by that shift in the investor focus on what companies are doing in terms of sustainability. And I don't think most people would have expected that it would be the investment community which would play such a big role.
Thank you, Catherine. And Susan, from your perspective, how do you see this shift?
Yeah, I agree with Catherine. I think the 2019 bushfires, the pandemic, have really fueled the prioritisation of the discipline of corporate social responsibility in the Australian context. And there's been similar movements globally. I mean, obviously the pandemic is global, but the Black Lives Matter in the US has put pressure on companies, and their stakeholders are expecting companies and the brands they buy from to be doing more in terms of social issues and social equality. I think it's certainly the case at the start of 2020, many sustainability leaders like myself really feared that we were going to have losses in our evolving industry. You know, I was really nervous that I might have to let people off. But the reverse has been the case. The demand for sustainability professionals in the Australian context is at a record high at the moment. You know, businesses are increasingly recognising that sustainability is core to their value proposition, their business strategy, you know, their products, and as we talked about before, their social licence.
Thank you so much. Malcolm, are you thinking something similar? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, there's always a spectrum of behaviour, good, bad and average in companies as there is in society generally in terms of the moral spectrum. But for example, you do see companies, often companies that have grown substantially and are still run by a founder who might be quite authoritarian, who don't treat people well. And there's many of other examples. So that will always be with us, but I'm firmly of the view that long-term sustainable shareholder value creation demands that a company meets community expectations, and often with those companies that don't, when they evolve into a much more conventional management structure, they need to change, and they do change. And as the other two speakers have been saying, there's a real change in the pressure and the ability to pressure from communities as a whole to pay as much attention to the planet and people as we do to profit generation. And I think great companies always will, and so they should.
Thank you. We are talking about big companies and corporations right now. We will bring it back to small business later on this evening. But following on from what we've just discussed, commercial success is easy to quantify. But can corporates actually measure the success or impact of their CSR initiatives? Is that possible? Susan?
Yeah, so, you know, I use the term CSR interchangeably with the term sustainability. So if that's confusing for some people, let me clarify that from the outset. CSR for me covers off, you know, the social, the environmental, the governance aspects. And so the short answer is yes, absolutely. You know, it depends what you're measuring though, right? Like on an emissions front, you can measure your emissions, but you can measure scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. For Australia Post, that's very important, particularly scope 3, which is our supplier emissions. You know, you can measure waste and waste volumes and recycling and gender metrics, and we've talked about gender pay equity. You know, Indigenous employment is really important in Australia, and for us at Australia Post, we have a bespoke measure for social licence to operate as well. So the short answer is yes, it depends on which element. I think it's the case that traditionally the social side of sustainability has been harder to measure. You know, what's a business's social impact from, say, procuring through social and Indigenous enterprises or investing in a particular non-profit organisation. But we've seen a huge evolution and maturation in that space in recent years. There's really great initiatives like the London Benchmarking Group, which is now referred to as Business for Societal Impact. That is really great to approach if you're interested in this space, and they provide guidance to companies about how they can measure their social impact in particular.
Thank you so much. It actually made me think, mining companies could probably measure their success by not blowing up sacred sites. But moving along to Malcolm, how do you think corporates can measure the success or impact of their CSR initiatives?
Look, I think it's always important to measure everything. Otherwise, it just becomes platitudes. And with communities, well, with people, let's do it in people and planet. With people, of course, safety is a really important one in the industries I operate in. And safety is quite easily measured, both in terms of injuries and incidents. But in the broader community, a little bit harder. Perhaps the amount of money that's allocated to communities, doing surveys to measure the impact and the welfare of those communities, and policies compared with peers are some of those measures. As far as the planet's concerned, as far as the environment's concerned, that's easier. As we're just saying, the CO2 equivalent emissions are measurable. In the environmental space, spills are measurable of toxic material. Clean-up of historical pollution, which in companies that have been around for over 100 years, there's plenty of that. So you can quantify that both in terms of the quantity and dollars concerned. But so I just reiterate, really important to measure and have measurements which people take seriously.
Thanks for that, Malcolm. And Catherine, what would you like to add to this?
Just building on the other commentary really, Anita, is that if you're running a large organisation, there's an old saying, what gets measured gets done. And so, in fact, people are looking to find robust measures and putting them in place. And the good news is, as has already been suggested, in fact, in terms of emissions, that's one of the more straightforward areas. And it is kind of all the big companies that I'm familiar with that is just being done as a matter of course now.
What a fantastic takeaway. Very simple. What gets measured gets done. There's lots of food for thought there indeed. Now we're going to jump to some of our audience questions. So thank you to everyone who sent those through. We had some fantastic questions come in. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them tonight, but we are hosting a CSR workshop with Westpac in the coming weeks for those of you who'd like to get more involved in the topic. Now, our first audience question comes from Maria Magdalena, and she asks, how would you forecast 2022 to 2025 in terms of game changers, and what is the direction we are taking globally in CSR? Catherine, do you mind if we hear from you first? What do you think the game changers will be?
Anita, I actually think we're right in the middle of the game changers right now, with the two really big directional shifts that are occurring is firstly on decarbonisation, and of course we've been talking about that already, and I just think that is going to become more and more prominent, and we're going to see more and more change on the regulatory front as well as community activity too. And then the other big shift that's occurring is of course in the digital space, and there isn't an industry or community for that matter that's not affected by digital change, and I think we're going to see more focus on that and what does that mean for people, including around privacy.
Really interesting. Thank you. Malcolm, what are your thoughts on the game changes?
Yes, so over the next three or 4 years, game changes by definition are sort of unexpected, and as COVID has shown us, often completely unpredictable. But let me have a go, particularly in terms of climate change. I think the things that might be game changers is if we suddenly start to see land ice, particularly in Antarctica and in Greenland, really starting to melt, and substantial changes in sea levels, or indeed some of the ice in the tundra melting, and a lot of carbon dioxide emissions increasing massively, I think they could really change the urgency and action in that spectrum. From a positive point of view, any breakthrough in what you might call storage technology, or what we might say batteries, where renewables like solar and wind can be stored for clearly nighttime or when the wind's not blowing. At the moment, that's really only pumped hydro in that space, and so any breakthrough in that technology, and a lot of people are working on it, will be a game changer, or indeed in new renewable technologies like hydrogen energy. And then we'll see a sudden shift in the same way that sort of between 1900, I think it was, and 1910, we went from horses to motor cars almost overnight. There could be more urgent government action. I'm not sure about that, unless there's some major political or geopolitical disruption, and the biggest one in this time frame, I think, would be a war in the Ukraine, which could lead to gas supplies to Europe being cut. And if Europe goes through a period of no heating and no electricity, you might see a backlash against the whole climate movement. So they're just some of the thoughts, but really it's speculation until they happen.
So much there already from Catherine and Malcolm. Susan, where do you think CSR is heading in the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how we all focused on this one slightly differently. I think for me the basic rule of being a responsible corporate citizen historically has focused on the principle of doing no harm. And I think we're at the beginning of seeing more companies focus in on the net positive, how they can use their assets and capabilities to create maximum social and environmental value. And there's some really interesting commentary in books around that at the moment, including from Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, that is worth getting your hands on. And in a tangible example, Microsoft a couple of years ago, or maybe it was only about 12 months ago, announced that by 2030 that they're going to be carbon negative. But they also made this really interesting commitment that was by 2050 they're going to remove from the environment all of the carbon that the company has emitted either directly or indirectly since the company was established in 1975. So it's an example of sort of net positive. And I think that that's phenomenal and gutsy. And, back to the point of, are businesses doing more than government, or are they even doing enough? I think that companies that make those sorts of commitments moving forward are going to really stand out. And also in the coming years, we're going to be seeing more in terms of sustainability reporting standards. And then as, related to that, the concept of an integrated P&L, as companies become more mature in the way that they measure social and environmental aspects of their sustainability agenda in particular, there will be, more sophisticated guidance around reporting an integrated P&L. And we've seen even in Victoria, companies like Yarra Valley Water take the lead in that. It's still early days, but I think we'll see more of that in the years to come.
Thank you so much, particularly around the conversation around, net positive positions, but also I thought to myself, imagine if every individual and every organisation and corporation woke up every day and said, I'm going to work from the position of doing no harm. That couldn't be a bad thing. Our next question comes from Shannon, who asks, in your experience, to what extent is CSR considered a marketing or public relations tactic? And how do you ensure your efforts are meaningful to avoid real or perceived greenwashing? Susan, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, look, I think the key to that is ensuring that you focus in on those things that relate to your social and environmental impacts, that relate to your business strategy, and not just doing anything because it's flavour of the month or because it's the chair of the board or the CEO or the executive team's desire or the sustainability manager's pet topic, you know. So from an Australia Post perspective, for example, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we've spoken about earlier underpin our approach to corporate social responsibility. But we know that we have that we intersect with some of those goals more directly than with others. So for Australia Post, we wouldn't really necessarily prioritise doing things around, SDG 14, which is underwater life, because very little of our impacts relate to the oceans and waterways. So I think honing in on that, and then at the same time, I would also say that while sustainability, corporate social responsibility is an evolving discipline and is a very technical, increasingly technical and complicated discipline, there's absolutely a role for marketing and PR in supporting that and in promoting the programs that companies do. And I think that when marketing teams don't grasp it and promote it, and when internal comms aren't promoting it, customers and internal stakeholders can feel like a company is not necessarily doing enough or doing anything at all. And I think, for Australia Post, I'm very proud of our sustainable packaging range, for example. But historically, we haven't really promoted that so much. And so a lot of people kind of feel that our packaging range leaves a bit to be desired, but I actually am incredibly proud of it from a full life cycle assessment perspective, from an environmental lens.
Thank you. We will come back to the internal engagement and staff shortly. But Malcolm, let's go to you next. What are your thoughts on greenwashing?
Greenwashing probably was more prevalent at the start of this new phase of environmental activism, say about 10 years ago. These days, people throughout the community are very alert to that type of behaviour and will certainly draw it to the community's attention through social media, as we've been saying. But it still does go on. So, for example, as Susan was alluding to, corporations and some corporations and indeed governments have made commitments around zero net emissions by 2050. In other words, being greenhouse neutral, without having the slightest idea as to how they're going to achieve that, and indeed relying on technology which doesn't exist. So I think we just have to make sure that it's very easy to give in to pressures to make pronouncements, but they do have to have integrity. Otherwise, that of itself will lead to community backlash.
Indeed. Thank you, Malcolm. Catherine, what would you say to Shannon? How would you answer Shannon's question?
I think, like the others, it's just actually much more challenging for people to use greenwashing. And that is because there is a much more informed community, there is a much more stronger audience who are certainly willing to use social media to communicate concerns. And the reality is and of course, as you've already picked up, Anita, I do tend to come from the big end of town. The reality is that having a social license to operate is absolutely key if we're going to have sustainable businesses and long-term organisations. So that's what drives you, and therefore you have to be robust in terms of what you're doing. And Malcolm was just touching there on people making heroic statements and having no plans to get there. That is a very precarious place to be for if you're a board director, to make a statement and not have a way of delivering on it. You're just opening yourself up to a level of exposure there. So there's a lot of forces now that really make it wildly sensible for people to be robust in what they're doing and what they're saying they're doing.
Really helpful answers there. Thank you so much. We're just going to move on to our next question. We've got so many fabulous questions coming in. Now, all of our panellists are from big organisations. You have significant budgets, teams of people who can be involved in a CSR strategy. Now, for our audience members watching who are either own a small business or maybe they're in a startup or they're working in one, Peter has asked, what advice would you all have for implementing some of the CSR strategies you've discussed on a smaller scale? Malcolm, can we go to you first, please?
Yes. Look, a caveat here, I've always operated in big business, although my parents did have a small business. So if you operate a small business, please forgive me. But it is really tough in that sector because every dollar counts, and many of the social corporate social responsibility actions are seen by small businesses being a cost, and unless you've got a startup in that sector, that's not necessarily so. So I recall with a pump company that was part of my responsibilities at one stage, were worried about the costs of having to recycle wastewater. This was probably 20 years ago. And indeed, when they got into it, actually found that it saved them money because they weren't then paying water rates. Similarly with renewables, if you get a good solar system, it can reduce energy costs significantly. So I think it's very important for small businesses to look for the upside in these areas and not just see it as yet another impost from governments. And if they do, they will flourish and they'll become big businesses.
That sounds really positive and hopeful. Catherine, what about you? What advice do you have for the small business owner or the employee, as it were?
I'm, Anita, going to go to my experience with the not-for-profits that I'm involved in, which typically are much, much smaller and range from a couple of employees up to, maybe 40 or so employees. So I hope that's more relatable. And in fact, importantly, I'm going to say it becomes even more critical for a lot of the people in those businesses that the organisations are seen to do the right thing. And the really obvious place to start, I'm going to say, I think for lots of organisations is just with where they source power. And that can actually be very, very helpful in terms of switching there. And, most of us run households, so we know the sort of things that we need to look at in terms of how do you make a difference. And certainly the not-for-profits I'm involved in pay at least as much attention to it as the big corporates do.
Fantastic, thank you. Susan, what advice do you have for small business on implementing CSR initiatives?
Thank you. Yeah, look, Australia Post sometimes describes itself as a big business made up of small businesses because we have licensees all around the country. At the same time, small businesses are a huge part of our customer base. And so this is an area that I actually have given a lot of thought to. Last year, we actually issued a white paper to help customers or small business customers build back better following COVID-19. And there's a white paper that you can find online if you are a small business watching today. If you type in Australia Post Small Business Sustainability, it should come up. And it's got a detailed roadmap in there of the steps that small businesses could consider to be more sustainable. But I have to agree with some of the points made that sometimes small businesses fear, the concept of sustainability, and even large businesses sometimes feel like sustainability is going to cost more, and actually it can be a point of efficiency and cost savings. And the other thing I would say is, focus in on those areas of your where your greatest impacts are, right? Where your greatest potential negative or not so great environmental or social impacts are. Hone in on those. Listen to what your stakeholders and your customers and your workforce, think is important in the same way as doing that is really important for large businesses. I would say the same is true for small businesses.
So many useful tips there. If you're watching tonight, or you are watching, do let us know through the comment box what you can take away from particularly those answers from that question. I'm going to bring in two audience questions here because both Matthew and Susie asked about CSR from the internal perspective, such as company culture and getting staff actively involved in CSR initiatives, which we've kind of touched on. Now, to our panellists, what have your experiences been in terms of cultural change in the CSR journey, and how have you engaged staff effectively in your CSR initiatives? Susan, I'm going to go to you first. How have you found culture has impacted your ideas and initiatives in CSR?
From an Australia Post perspective, we've always had, we are legislated to provide a community service and to turn a profit. And, there are over 4,000 post offices around Australia, and the post office is often in the heart of the community. So for us, we naturally have a very inclusive and community focused culture. And so often people come to Post or stay with Post because of that aspect of our culture. But it has been harder to get people to focus in on the environmental aspects of sustainability. So I feel like we've taken steps in recent years, and we've got our own War on Waste at Post and try to educate our people about how they can do things differently to reduce our environmental impacts. But it has been harder on that front, and I feel like we're still making progress. The other thing is in terms of our values. So, we describe our values as ties that bind us. So trust, inclusivity, empowerment and safety. And for me, as somebody that sort of researched and studied sustainability, I see sustainability cutting through all of that. But for frontline staff, posties, people that might work in our delivery centres, contractors, if they're not hearing sustainability, they don't necessarily see it. So I think that you need to make it really practical and digestible and design things in a way that they feel empowered to take those actions and that are very local as well, that they can make change.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, Catherine, you are at the big end of town, but of course you've mentioned not-for-profits. Can you talk a little bit about those experiences? Are they different in terms of the way in which staff engage in the strategies in those organisations?
I'm going to start by saying, Anita, that really in the organisations that I'm involved in, I would have said our staff and employees are demanding that the organisations really lean into sustainability. And so rather than having to push them so much, and that doesn't mean there aren't some things that are challenging, of course there are, but in fact, one of the first ones I was involved in when I was involved in logistics is that back in the 2000s, where we had customers demanding that we could demonstrate that we'd reduce carbon emissions. It was the way that drivers actually drove that really led to a 30% reduction in emissions over a couple of years. So they were absolutely at the heart of it. And I think what's really interesting, and both Susan and Malcolm have talked about it already, we're all involved in businesses that have got a strong operational focus and a strong industrial focus. So the area of safety has been really important, whereby for organisations in Australia, most of us have reduced our incident of injuries or lost time injuries by over 90% plus in the last 20 years, which has really provided us with a blueprint about how do you go about bringing really fundamental cultural change in organisations. And I see a lot of the lessons that we've learned on the safety journey now being applied in other areas, including sustainability, because every site knows that this is something that's important, and you share experiences and you learn from when things go wrong elsewhere. How do we make a difference? So I guess I see that for most organisations, whether it's big end of town or smaller not-for-profits, I would actually see that often it's employees who are really on the front foot and wanting to see change here and want to work for an organisation that's really responsible on the environmental front.
That's really good to hear. Malcolm, is that your experience? What would you say about organisational culture and CSR?
Well, firstly, I think culture is absolutely crucial to the success of any organisation. I mean, companies consist of ideas and products, and actually nothing happens to those ideas or products until people do something with them. And the passion and commitment with which they do that makes the difference between average or poor performance and outstanding performance. And it's also important that culture aligns with an individual's culture, so that the values they have at home are the same. They wouldn't feel uncomfortable with the values at work. And in today's world, as we've all been saying, the issue of a corporate social responsibility, particularly in terms of the areas of community and climate, are fundamental to the values of our employees. So incorporating that into the corporate culture is a very important way of motivating them and getting them aligned to the company, and together then we can create a better, outstanding and great company. And so I just think culture is so fundamental to every part of business, and in particular to social responsibility.
Thank you, Malcolm, and for the added reminder of values, which obviously has been touched on this evening already. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question tonight, which comes from Vincent, and he asks, how important is an organisation's legacy as discussed in the boardroom in the context of delivering profit, planet and people objectives? And can you share any insights into the legacy you have wanted to create within your own organisations? I'm going to come back to you now, Malcolm. What are your thoughts around legacy in this space?
Yeah, many years ago I read a terrific book called Good to Great by Collins and Porras, and they analysed companies that have been in the top 100 in the US stock index for over 100 years, and why those companies have remained so successful, and really the products they've produced over that 100 years had changed sometimes fundamentally. But what had not changed was the values, and the values had remained the core identifier of those companies. So as this whole discussion has been about, corporate social responsibility is a core value, and it's a value which will hopefully go on and remain central to outstanding companies and to all companies well into the future, and therefore will companies which follow those values and act in an ethical way will endure, and they will be ones that leave a very positive legacy.
Thank you. Susan, what are your thoughts on legacy in the organisation you work for?
In terms of legacy of Australia Post, well, I think the first thing is it's Australia's largest or oldest company as it is to begin with, so it's already got a pretty amazing legacy. But I think our purpose is around connecting communities and serving everyone, no matter where they are around Australia, and providing accessibility of service for everyone. So those things really very much are core to many of the issues that we've been talking about today in terms of social impact and social support. So I think there's that. I think in terms of my own legacy, when I joined Australia Post 6 years ago now, the idea of corporate social responsibility was there, but not really there. We saw really good practice in safety or in diversity or in community programs, but it wasn't really married up, and it wasn't being strategic, and it wasn't related to our our business strategy and our core purpose. And so during the time I've been there, we've worked hard to have a holistic, integrated approach to corporate responsibility, holding ourselves to account with a strategy that's got very clear commitments and targets. We've, under Christine Holgate and Nicole Sheffield, they elevated the function of sustainability, and I became the first Chief Sustainability Officer, and so I'm enormously proud of that. But I think having sort of an integrated, holistic, publicly accountable approach has been really important to me and what I've tried to bring about. And then also I'm really pleased of the role that I've played in helping to elevate discussions of sustainability at a board level. Our board is enormously supportive of our sustainability agenda today, and their understanding and commitment has grown, and they're asking increasingly complicated questions and demanding more, and so they should. And so I'm proud to have been at the business during those years.
Thank you, Susan. I think, as you mentioned, the Australia Post being the oldest business in the country, I think it's wonderful that we can now, as everyone tuning in tonight, can actually hear some more about the sustainability policies and values and so forth. Now, Catherine, what would you say about legacy, both personally and for an organisation?
Well, I'm actually going to start on the organisation front, Anita, because in fact, sitting in a boardroom, I'm going to say it's always all about how are we positioned for the future. And that means because we want to be successful in the medium to long term. And that means about being agile and adapting. And, Malcolm just talked about how really successful organisations do morph as the world changes. So you want to be really, the real commitment I have is to help the organisations be well positioned and on a path to great success going forward. In terms of my legacy, I did engineering because I love problem solving. I'm a real problem solving junkie, and it's really simple to me. I just want to make a difference and leave the place better as a result for me being involved. And actually doing engineering was a great foundation for that sort of view of the world and what I wanted to achieve.
I think that was a wonderful question to end on this evening, and thank you for your answers. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. I'd like to thank Debbie, Susan, Malcolm and Catherine for their time, as well as you, our amazing alumni from around the world, for sending in your questions and joining us to learn from some of the incredible change makers in our community. We will be in touch shortly with some further resources from our conversation, including a commentary piece from our panellists and some more information on the CSR workshop later this month. Please share tonight's discussion with your networks to generate your own conversations, and continue to send in any questions you may have. It's been wonderful to be here with you all, if only through a screen. Thank you again for joining us tonight, or perhaps it's the morning wherever you are. Take care. Good night.